We are very privileged to have Vonya Womack with us today. She's the Executive Director of Refugees Unknown, Stories Untold, which is RUSU. And she is an authority on violations of refugee human rights. She's a keynote speaker. She's an international presenter. She's a very devoted advocate who provides her audiences with a new perspective on how storytelling can help find solutions to the refugee crisis while providing meaning for those who have experienced, trauma as refugees. She has established international social justice initiatives in Haiti and Eastern Europe, and she's developed global leaders in Libya and is a spokesperson for international human rights in Scandinavia and Europe. So Vonya also incorporates her interest in business and human rights into her adjunct teaching and speeches at Villanova University and Cedar Crest College, where she teaches courses in human rights, development, economics, and global leadership. So that would be the introduction to our speaker. And I would just like everyone to know that it's mandatory to keep your camera on during the entire session. And for your own benefit, please do make the session very interactive, ask questions. And Vonya, you have up to 2 hours for the entire session, and you can leave as much time for the lecture and for the questions as you like. That's
great. Okay, very good. Well, it's great to see you guys. I apologize for being a little bit late here. I just came from teaching another class, and I had to find a location that was a little different than what I had planned. So thank you for waiting for me here. But I'm excited to talk to you. And what I thought I would do today, I have a slide set, and we'll kind of use that as our guide. But we're going to talk about a couple different things. We're going to talk about dialogue. We're going to talk about conversation and the difference between dialogue and conversation. We're going to talk about human rights, and we're going to talk about global leadership and how all 4 of those things kind of go together. Does that sound good? Because you know what, you guys are involved in something here. As I looked at some of the other lectures that you were having online and some of the information and things that you're learning, you are becoming dialogue experts, really, in different, in whatever field. And if you look at what the world needs, we definitely need people that are dialogue experts. So I commend you for taking this course and anything along the lines like this. So I'm excited to kind of get to know you a little bit, but we'll go right ahead and we'll start with some of these with our slides, and that way we can I can stay on track maybe. All right. So let me share my screen here a second. All right, well, we'll see if that'll work, if I can see. Okay. So what is the difference between dialogue and conversation? I figured we would start there because these are 2 different terms, but these 2 different terms are related to each other. So dialogue and conversation, I think you guys would agree that they are used interchangeably, right? But they actually have some nuanced differences between them in their meanings. And so I'm going to give you kind of a breakdown of that. So if you look at the first one, it says dialogue. So dialogue often implies a more structured or purposeful exchange of ideas, right? Insights and perspectives into things. Dialogues are commonly associated with how we solve problems together in society, how we reconcile differences, for example, or how we deepen our understanding of something. Conversation tends to be a more broader term, right? This is a verbal interaction between people. It could be casual, it could be informal, or it could just be aimless. But it also has kind of this deep and purposeful meaning similar to dialogue, or it can. Now, dialogue also tends to be, I guess you could say, more structured, right? There are more rules, in regards to the format. In certain groups, for example, dialogue groups, participants might be given a specific amount of time, like for me, right, to speak without, any kind of interruption, although I encourage your interruption. So anytime you want to interrupt me for questions, you feel free to do so. But I will make sure that we have that on the end as well. And then conversation has more of an organic flow to it, with participants that are able to kind of speak more freely, they kind of respond more freely, and it doesn't always necessarily follow a specific format. But I'm guessing that you guys would agree that we need both. We need dialogue and we need conversation in whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish or to do. Okay, so this is our agenda. We're going to talk about the difference between dialogue and conversation a little bit more. We're going to talk then, we're going to kind of move into a history of human rights. Just because I know that many of you have kind of heard about, you've had some human rights lectures, et cetera, but I really want to go just to the basics of that so we can remember how universal international human rights came to play. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit of that. We're going to talk about the importance of global leadership in human rights. Then I'm going to give you 2 case studies. So I want to talk about a case study that has to do with Turkish women and children in prisons and the human rights violations around that. Then we're also going to talk about a case study about brokering peace, something called the Mother's Call in Israel and Palestine. And I tell you that because I'm actually headed there on Sunday. For this event. And I was, working on it and I thought, this might be a really good thing to talk about when we're talking about conversation and dialogue. So I put that in there. And then I want to finish it up by talking about the need for dialogue experts today. And that goes really to you guys. Okay. So, these are just some more things about dialogue and conversation, right? So dialogue is usually it's more of a depth of a conversation, exploration, and intent to reach some kind of an understanding or a consensus among people. Conversations vary in length, right? From surface level small talk to more profound exchanges that can actually be similar to dialogue. Dialogue, as I mentioned before, can be used in more formal kinds of setting, academic settings, interfaith dialogues, there would be another example. Conversations can apply to different kinds of settings, casual, professional, academic, otherwise. And dialogue often, this is one here, often has a goal. It might be meeting, or having that mutual understanding about something. It could be resolving a conflict. Or it could be even brainstorming about different kinds of solutions to problems or issues. And then conversation, the outcome can be varied, right? Sometimes the main goal is social interaction. Sometimes it's entertainment. All right, I think we get the idea. Dialogue and conversation. So while all dialogues can be considered conversations, not all conversations are necessarily dialogues. Right? But it's essential that we note and that we really think about this, that these distinctions are kind of nuanced, right? The terms are used interchangeably in our everyday language. And so oftentimes, as I'm talking to people about dialogue, they may say, well, let's have a conversation, right? So there's those 2 things, and we're going to talk about how these 2 fit into a number of different things here coming up. But first, what if we didn't have it? Imagine if we had neither of these. If we didn't have dialogue or conversation, it would fundamentally alter our human society, right? It would affect our relationships. It would affect our individual and our collective growth of even economies we could put in there. So we would have a couple different things. If we didn't have dialogue and we didn't have conversation, we would have a lack of social bonds, right? Conversation is a fundamental element, we can say, of our human connection. And if you look at how interconnected our world is, this is key to not only, dialogue, but it's key to peace and peace without conflict. With dialogue or conversation, forming and maintain relationships is easier, right? Intimate, trust, understanding, all those kinds of things. Now, if we didn't have either one of these, we would have a stunted cultural and intellectual growth. because this is how ideas move. Conversations and dialogue, that's how ideas spread. That's how they evolve. That's how they mature. With them, we have cultural, intellectual, and technological advances. And those things will continue the more conversation and the more dialogue we have. Reduced conflict resolution, right? Effective dialogue is crucial for resolving misunderstandings and resolving conflicts. Because if we don't have the ability to converse with each other, then disputes will persist. They could escalate, and also they could, be resolved through nonverbal kinds of means, and that could include violence. So we see kind of the importance there of having them. There you go. The next one here, there we go. We would have less group cohesion. Conversations help us. They help us to maintain our groups. They help us establish normalities, right? Our traditions. And without it, communities and societies would struggle to form any kind of cohesive identity. Also, stunted personal growth and self-awareness. Because we have conversations, we often gain insights into our thoughts, just ourselves, our own feelings, our own behaviors. Feedback from other people helps us to grow and evolve. I mean, we see feedback everywhere. You see feedback on your work as students. You see feedback in your professional jobs and lives, right? You get feedback from your kids. You get feedback from home, all of that. Another one is difficulty in transitioning knowledge. So think about that for a second, about oral traditions and teachings and how they're conveyed through dialogue. They've been the bedrock of knowledge and transition throughout human history, because without having conversation or dialogue, then every generation would start with limited knowledge. Just on that, I'll give you an example. I was just teaching a human rights course, and I was teaching about Guatemala and the civil war that happened in Guatemala from like 1960 really until the 1980s, actually 1990s. And a lot of students weren't aware of this genocide that happened. Over 200,000 people died during this period of time, and this was the Mayans up in the highlands in Guatemala, and their struggles over 100 years have really been passed down through conversation and through dialogue, because there wasn't heavy education in those areas. And so you had people telling stories, right? And that's the importance of that, again, in regards to transmitting knowledge. Economic and functional challenges. So many aspects of our own, modern economy, when we look at infrastructure, all of that depends on communication. Everything from commerce to education to governance would face extreme challenges without the tool of having verbal interaction with each other. So here's just a couple more, and then we'll move into something else here. But increased dependence on nonverbal communication. So we are inherently communicative, right? If verbal dialogue and conversation weren't an option, we'd likely rely on more heavily on nonverbal forms of communications, like our gestures, body language, written kind of formats. Also, challenges in collaboration. So many human achievements are the result of collaboration. And those collaborations happened because of conversation, because of teamwork, because of group efforts. So those things are important to be protected. Isolation. Without the ability to communicate verbally, we might experience feelings of isolation, leading to psychological and emotional distress. In fact, you saw that during kind of 2020, right? During the shutdown of different things, at least here in the United States, we definitely saw issues in regards to psychological and emotional distress, as I'm sure much of the world did. So here's the thing to remember is that as human beings, we are incredibly adaptive, right? I mean, if dialogue and conversation were completely removed from our toolbox that we have, we'd likely evolve other means of connections, of understanding, or of collaborations. But those means would be way less efficient and effective than what we can do with verbal communication, especially when it comes around conversation and dialogue. So anyways, today we're going to talk about this conversation and dialogue, what we now feel like I've beat into your head, probably. We're going to talk about human rights and global leadership and how these things fit into that. So I said I was going to give you a little bit of a background on human rights. All right. So I see that my slide there didn't show up so good. And in fact, you know what? I can't actually even read it, but I think I can read the last two. So if you can see the first two, I think it says why study human rights. But then the last two, it says that everyone needs to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, right? And understanding human rights is crucial for addressing global challenges, which I'm going to give you two of here in a little bit. Discrimination, inequality, injustice, those are all important things. So let me give you a little bit of a historical context. All right, so we have to examine kind of or understand this historical context. And by doing that, I'm going to kind of take you back to a period of time called the Enlightenment era. Okay, and that's when individuals kind of started to realize that they possessed their own kind of human rights. All right. And then we have the horrors of World War II, and I'll go a little bit further into that. And that emphasized the need to safeguard human dignity. And that led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which went into effect in 1948. All right. So the Enlightenment era. So it was called the Age of Enlightenment, and it was kind of this philosophical time, intellectual time, and you could call it a cultural movement. And this happened during the 17th and 18th centuries. All right, so there was a strong emphasis that people put on science and reason and individualism, and they believed in this human progress. Right, that we will progress as humans. And one of the central ideas that came out during this time was this concept that all individuals possess inherent rights. And then that led to the foundation for modern notions about how we think about human rights and how we think about democracy today. So you know, the impact of this time period, kind of this Enlightenment idea, was really profound for us because they contributed to the development of democratic governance, individual rights, and the spread of human rights principles worldwide. And the Enlightenment era laid the groundwork for the American and French revolutions and subsequent movements that actually happened where they were advocating for equality, liberty, and justice for everybody, for all individuals. So here's a little bit more. So the Enlightenment ideals revolved around, like I mentioned, reason and rationality. Okay, so they valued them because they said, you know what, these are vital tools for us to comprehend the world as we know it, and for us to be able to make informed decisions. Now, this movement was actually influenced by a scientific revolution, and it embraced empirical observation and scientific inquiry into challenge, established beliefs. So all of a sudden, things are kind of getting challenged that people believed. It emphasized individualism So it challenged like these social hierarchies that had been built, and it introduced something called secularism, right? Secularism. And that was by advocating the separation of religious and political domains. So the whole idea around this is there's a core belief was in human progress through reason. And the idea was we're going to advance society. We're going to overcome ignorance, superstition, and oppression. All right. So that's an Enlightenment era. Now, they had this idea then that the individuals possess individual rights, right? This was a huge development. And it was, like I said, the main thing that came out of this time period. It challenged the traditional notion of political power and how authority is derived solely from divine sources, like monarchs claiming a divine right to rule, for example. And several key Enlightenment philosophers contributed to the formulation of the concept of these inherent rights. So these are three people I just wanted to introduce you to. I always try to give an idea to people about where does all this kind of stuff come from, right? Well, here's three different people, and I'm gonna go into, I promise, not too much, but I just want to tell you like who they are, because as you go on to study, and maybe you already have heard of their names, but you very well could run into these names again. So John Locke, so his idea was on natural rights. So he wrote this work, and it was called Two Treatises of Government. And he was greatly influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers. So he argued, he said, you know what? Individuals possess natural rights to life and to liberty and to property. And governments are established in order to protect those rights. So if a government fails in its duty, then citizens have the right to overthrow it. Okay, so this was this guy, John Locke. That's what he believed. And then there was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, okay? And he developed something called the social contract. And he proposed this idea. He said, we should have a social contract between citizens and a state. He believed that individuals should unite to form a collective body. Okay, so it should be politic. It should flow or in unite to form a collective body, agreeing to follow laws that were created for the common good and for protecting individual freedoms. Okay. And then our last guy, he wrote about the spirit and the laws. Okay, so he proposed the concept of separation of powers within the government to prevent abuses of power. So this whole idea was influenced by the development of the modern democratic systems where there are checks and balances in governments and in democracies. So I just wanted to give you an idea of who these three people were and how the Enlightenment era influenced kind of future leaders, right? And how the Enlightenment era has given us, in a sense, this notion of human rights of the individual and where we have taken that so far. And then at the end, we'll talk about where we think it needs to go, right? Okay, so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Increasing poverty, climate change, injustice, attacks on people offline and online. Are our rights fading? Where do human rights live? They live in each of us. We have the chance to know, claim, and defend our rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights still speaks to us all. Its 30 articles transcend values, cultures, and borders, declaring that we are all human and all equal in dignity and in rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights unites us. To counter the current attacks on human rights, we need stronger and broader alliances involving all of us, governments, human rights defenders, the media, everyone. This year, as we celebrate 75 years of the Declaration standing up for our rights, It's your turn. Find the rights that resonate with you, claim them, stand up for them. In dignity, freedom, and justice for all, stand up for human rights.
All right. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two covenants, right? This in 1948, it was the first legal document that protected universal human rights, and it's generally agreed to be the foundation of international human rights law. So this, together with something called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, those three I consider kind of instruments. They formed the so-called International Bill of Human Rights. Okay. So this was all adopted in 1945, and it's expanded to be this international human rights law. Now, in 2007, the General Assembly adopted also the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay. All right, so there's a whole framework around human rights. There are almost, before I go into this, I like to talk to people about their kind of two different camps, right? You have people that work on policy, people that work on rules and laws and governance in regards to human rights. And then you have people that are grassroots, working on the ground, that are advocates, that are fighting for the voice or to be a voice for human rights abuses and violations that happen. And oftentimes what I've found in working, I've spoken at the United Nations, Amnesty International, all over the world. And it's very interesting to see how we're segregated into silos with these two different things. And so more dialogue and more conversation around people that work within human rights, that push policy, right? That work with nation states, that hold people accountable by rule of law, et cetera. And the people that are on the ground and with the technology that we have today, bringing human rights to the forefront immediately, right? Making sure that we can create better dialogue and conversation between these groups is going to be key, especially for you guys as future leaders. With all of the movement that we have in the world, just in migration, refugee crisis, political refugees, more polarization in the world, right? Creating more natural disasters, climate change, et cetera, that your generation, you guys are going to be the leaders, if you're not already, within that sphere. And whatever work it is that you do, you can always touch something there. So I encourage you to do that. But we definitely need more conversation and dialogue there. So this whole human rights framework, let's skip back to that. We're talking about, international treaties and conventions that have been established in order to uphold, human rights. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I mentioned this before, the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And there's also many more that have been developed. And these treaties create these legal obligations that states are supposed to follow to protect and promote human rights, right? Are supposed to follow is what I said. And we know that human rights are rampant all over the world, the United States as well. I mean, it's something that has that is rampant, I would say, in the world right now. So types of human rights. So we can really categorize these into kind of three different groups. But first of all, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the OHCHR, you guys may have heard about that, headquartered in Geneva, right, with many regional offices all over. And it has led the responsibility in the United Nations system for the promotion and protection of human rights. And that office actually supports human rights components of peacemaking missions. And they do that in several countries. In addition to those regional offices, they've got centers, country standalone offices, and human rights advisors that are located all over the world. So the High Commissioner for Human Rights regularly comments on different situations that are happening in the world in regard to human rights issues, violations, abuses. And they have the authority to investigate situations and to publish reports on them. So that's kind of their main thing, their main importance there. So the Human Rights Council was established in 2006, and that also meets in Geneva, and it replaced the 60-year-old UN Commission on Human Rights as the key independent UN intergovernmental body responsible for human rights. Okay, so this is the Human Rights Council. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see that sometimes I often go after them. So you can do that. I'll do the Twitter and Instagram for my organization, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end, is at Refugees Unknown. At Refugees Unknown, you can find me there. All right, so human rights in the United Nations, human rights treaty bodies, we talked about that, but each state party to a treaty has an obligation to take steps to ensure that everyone in the state can enjoy the rights that's set out in that treaty. Okay, there are these committees that are put together of independent experts, and what they do is they monitor implementation of really the core international human rights treaties. So these bodies are composed of independent experts, people that are recognized for their competence in human rights. They're nominated. They're often elected for fixed renewable terms of 4 years by different state parties. Special advisor to the prevention of genocide. That person, what they do is they kind of raise awareness about the causes and the dynamics of genocide, and they alert the people that need to be alerted in regards to the risk of genocide and to advocate and to mobilize for appropriate action. There's the special advisor on the responsibility to protect, and that person actually leads a more of a conceptual kind of process or a political process, institutional, operational development of the responsibility to protect. And I tell you these things because, when you hear different human rights abuses and violations, and you hear the stories, that's what impacts us, right? It's the stories that we hear. We understand that there are advocates, there's people that work on the ground to raise voices. We understand that there's people that work on the policy level, but a lot of times what we don't understand is that policy level, how they have to operate or what that kind of looks like. And we don't really dive into that unless you're taking some human rights specific course, right? So I'm just trying to kind of give you a high level of, okay, this is human rights, in the United Nations. This is what this looks like there. These are the kinds of committees that are involved. These are the advisors. There are people that hold these kinds of roles. All right, that's the purpose kind of in doing that. So a little bit of history on the human rights I want to go into, because that all happened after World War II. So I always like to take people back just a little bit to the Nuremberg trials. All right. But special procedures, there's two different things. There's special procedures, and then there's the Human Rights Working Group. So special procedures, what does that mean? If you ever hear that, and you're talking about human rights on a level where you're looking at the United Nations or even the EU as well, human rights councils right? Those are those independent experts that work on a voluntary basis. They examine, they monitor, they publicly report. They advise on human rights with country-specific perspectives. You see every year human rights reports comes out on countries, and you have access to that you can look up. The UNDG, Human Rights Working Group, what they do is they work to advance human rights by mainstreaming efforts within the UN development system. All right, so just two more kind of areas that fall within that kind of public policy more level for you to get an idea of what's behind that. Now, here's something. This is the Nuremberg trials, right? So in October of 1945, as he awaited trial as a major war criminal, Robert Ley, that was his name, he wrote a long and kind of a statement, you could say, about the German leaders being tried for their war crimes, right? And this indictment that was served on Ley and on others, and this was actually in October, so coming up here, October 1945, he claimed that all the defendants formulated and executed a common plan or conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity as defined. So that's what they were being held for. But Ley, that's this man right here, he continued and he said, well, where is this plan? Show it to me. Where's the protocol or the fact that only those that are here accused met and said a single word about what the indictment referred to so monstrously? Not a thing of it is true. That's what he said. So a few days later, guess what happened? He committed suicide in his cell rather than face the shame of a public trial. But the whole thing around this was there was an unease about the legal basis of the trial because it wasn't confined to those who were there to stand before it. So legal opinion in Britain and the United States was divided on the right of the victors to bring German leaders before a court of war criminals or war crimes. And this was something called the Nuremberg Military Tribunal. And, as Ley realized, as he, kind of in this, he said, for the first time, leaders of a major state were to be arraigned for an international community for conspiring to perpetrate and cause to be perpetrated a whole series of crimes against peace and against humanity. So this trial, I tell you about this because this proved to be the foundation of what has now become a permanent feature of modern international justice, happened with this trial. It all happened right within the context of World War II. It took place after World War II, where Nazi Germany, led by Hitler, had committed heinous crimes, including genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. There was an international tribunal, and that was the Nuremberg trial that I just talked about. It was the first international tribunal of its kind. And what they did is they held a series of military tribunals in Nuremberg, Germany, so the Nuremberg trials. And that happened from 1945 to 1946. And all the leaders that were involved in Nazi Germany were held accountable there. There were charges, including crimes against peace, so planning, initiating, waging wars of aggression, war crimes, violations against humanity, atrocities that were committed against civilians. And then there was what the trial really represented is that it established this principle that individuals could be held accountable for their actions, right? Even if they were following orders from a higher authority. And so that principle is now a cornerstone in our international criminal law that we have. This is where that whole legal framework came out of. It marked the development of kind of new legal concepts in human rights and principles involving recognition of crimes against humanity and international law. This is where actually crimes against humanity came from. It introduced that term where we didn't have it before. The widespread and systematic attacks on civilians, including acts like genocide, extermination, enslavement, and deportation. And these things are going to be evident, like when we talk about crimes against humanity, I'm going to talk about how those things fit into the two case studies that I'm going to talk about, one in regards to Turkey and the other one in regards to Palestine and Israel. And then evidence and testimonies, people were heard. There were judgment and sentences. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. 3 received life imprisonment and 4 received various other prison terms. 3 were actually acquitted. That's not talked about a lot, but they were. So it set the precedence for future trials for war criminals, and it led to this establishment of the principle that, you know what, if you commit atrocities, then you should be held accountable, regardless of the position it is that you hold. Okay, so that's what came out of that. Another thing that came out of this too was some dialogue, right? Critiques and controversies. People started talking about it. People were criticizing it. They claimed that, like the victor's justice and the challenge of retroactively applying these laws. But it still remained a significant step, I guess you could say, forward when it talks about promoting justice and accountability and preventing future atrocities from happening. And then it also gave Holocaust awareness. So the trial drew global attention to the extent of the Holocaust and the atrocities that were committed by the Nazi regime. This is just a little bit more about Leigh's argument, but I kind of hit on him pretty much before. So the conclusion really of this whole, of the Nuremberg trials is it gave us a legal framework, right? Crimes against humanity came out of it. Evidence and testimonies came out of it. Conversation and dialogue. Judgment and sentences came forth. Legacy and impact. It set this precedent for future trials of war criminals and led to different kinds of principles for those who commit these kinds of atrocities. And then the formation of international law. And like I said, Holocaust awareness that I mentioned. All right, so this one, I'm just going to skip over that. So when we look at applying human rights, we can say that they're not abstract concepts, right? They're applied in real life situations. And in fact, one of the things that I was in Denmark last summer, and I was at the Parliament building there talking about the Turkey Tribunal. So because of what has been happening, and I'll talk more about that, but because of what's been happening, that Turkey Tribunal was sitting, is sitting in the courts. And so that's an important kind of follow-up to say, you know what, these Nuremberg trial happened, and then we had the trials, based on Serbia and Kosovo, and then we had the trials, that happened in Guatemala, for example, where actually that was the first time that a state, Guatemala, judged their own past leader, right? And then, and not an international criminal court, but in Guatemala they did. And then, what we have in more recent times, like with after the 2016 coup that happened in Turkey, and the enforced disappearances, the kidnappings overseas, the women and children in prison, which is what I'm going to talk about more with you. The silent genocide that's happening, the minority groups that are there, the Kurds, Levites, etc. So, human rights, are not abstract ideas. They can be applied in real life. We'll talk about those case studies. We'll talk about some practical approaches around the complexities of those as well. The International Criminal Court. So I just kind of mentioned that to you before in regards to what's happening with Turkey, but I'm not going to go into specific kind of what that is, I don't think, with you, because I think I can have more dialogue and conversation with you here coming up around the stuff that I really want to get to and talk about. But it is important to know about the International Criminal Court and how this was established, not how it was established, but that it was established in 1998 to create a permanent court that is responsible for prosecuting individuals accused of committing serious international crimes. And those serious international crimes can be genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression. Okay, so they operate independently and impartially. They have their own prosecutor and judges. Its jurisdiction covers cases that occur within state parties. It acts kind of as a national court, that kind of thing. Their goal, they say, is to conduct fair trials, impose penalties like imprisonments or fines. They operate kind of on this principle of kind of complementary, they're kind of a complementary court, or they defer to national courts whenever possible. Over 120 countries are parties to the Rome Statute, though some of those major nations like the US, China, Russia, and India are not. Despite critiques kind of about their selectivity and their political pressure, the ICC, often is how it's termed, the International Criminal Court, aims to ensure accountability for grave international crimes and to prevent impunity, okay? So that's important to know. So how does global leadership, we're switching gears here just a little bit, how does global leadership fit into human rights? Well, it's really important for us to know that there are a couple different ways we can look at this, right? First of all, I mentioned we're interconnected more than ever. I mean, you guys, when I was back in even graduate school, I mean, I had a computer, but it was like, this is back in like 1995, 1996. Right? Our ways of communicating, our ways of dialogue were very different than what we have available to us now. So we are way more interconnected than we've ever been before, and that's only going to increase. The actions and policies of one country can have significant impacts on the people in other parts of the world. And I think you would agree with me on that. And so here's a couple different reasons that I have listed up here for you as why global leadership and human rights is really something that we need to remember and to look at. So we have universal values. Human rights are based on the premise that all humans deserve certain basic human rights and freedoms. And that's regardless of their background or their race, their religion or their gender, or their nationality. Global leadership actually helps affirm and propagate those kinds of universal values. Preventing abuses. So strong global leadership can act as a deterrent against human rights abuses. When leaders at the international level take a firm stand against violations that happen, then what does it do? It sends a clear message, right, to potential perpetrators of violence, or it's supposed to. I guess it depends on how good your listening skills are, right? Protecting vulnerable populations. So in many situations, marginalized and vulnerable groups like minorities, women, and children, and other groups within the community suffer the most from human rights abuses. And global advocacy can play a pivotal role in safeguarding those rights for people. Promoting peace and stability. Respect for human rights often goes hand in hand with peace and stability. And countries that prioritize human rights, they actually tend to experience fewer internal conflicts, which can have a positive spillover, if you think about it, when it comes to the effects for global peace. Economic and social development, the last one there. So human rights, including the right to educate, the right for health, the right to have decent work, those are crucial for economic and social development. But global leadership ensures that those rights are prioritized. So the reason is that you have more sustainable growth and you have more sustainable development if you look at it from an economic kind of perspective. So fostering international cooperation, right? When countries collaborate on human rights issues, what does it do? It fosters, a sense of international camaraderie, cooperation, and that actually can be elevated then into other kinds of global or used, I guess you could say, to address other kinds of global challenges. Creating accountability mechanisms. Global human rights leadership helps to establish and strengthen international institutions and the mechanisms that hold those violators accountable for different things. And that can include the things we just talked about, the international courts, the tribunals, various, UN bodies, et cetera, creating accountability. Setting a global standard. So effective global leadership helps to benchmark human rights practices. It also establishes a standard that countries can aim for and they can measure against. Okay. Responding to transnational challenges. So some human rights challenges, like, for example, human trafficking, they're transnational. Right? Global leadership is essential if you want to coordinate efforts across countries to address those different kinds of challenges. And finally, promoting global citizenship. Strong advocacy for human rights at the global level fosters a sense of global citizenship for people. And that's where we feel interconnected to each other, to global issues, and then we're more likely to act as advocates and as allies, right? We've got more of a diplomatic, conversation happening. So, with global leadership and human rights, it's important to remember that global leadership and human rights is not just a moral imperative, right? It's also a practical necessity. So in a world where information flows very quickly and events in one corner can influence events in another corner, collective and proactive stance on human rights is essential if we want to have global well-being and if we want to have global progress. All right, so now we're into our case studies a little bit. So the first thing I want to introduce you to is women in Turkish prisons. Now let me just see this just a second. Okay, I'm just going to go off my notes somewhere else. I'm just going to look somewhere else over here for just a second. So I recently spoke in Chicago at the Parliament of the World's Religions. And this is a whole nother thing I didn't add into kind of what we're talking about. I was trying to keep it to like 4 things only. But how the different sectors like that have to do with dialogue, and here you have religious dialogue at this conference. It's the largest conference of the world's religions. So there were religions represented, faiths, even atheist groups from all over the world that were there. And it was fascinating because the whole topic, the primary topic of this conference had to do with human rights and human dignity. Right? So you can see this whole thing of dialogue and conversation moving across different kinds of sectors. And that's one area where you're starting to see, because we've got more polarization happening with world leaders, we're starting to see more conflict and war. We're starting to bring to light more silent genocides that are happening, which I'm actually working on a book right now, and I'm writing about what's been happening in Turkey. So maybe before I give you this information, I should tell you a little bit about how I got involved in that. Do you guys want to hear that? Whoops. Is that a yes? I can't see you, so I think you're shaking your head. Okay. All right. So I I was in the pharmaceutical industry. I was in business for a long period of time. I was in banking and finance. And then I moved into higher education, and I taught for 10 years as a business professor. And during that period of time, I was at a university and I became their head of their global center. So I was taking students studying in the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, right? We were in Haiti. We were in the Czech Republic, learning about what had happened there. We were all over the place. But I was also in charge of internationalizing campus. And so my goal was to bring international people to speak to undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral level students at this university. And so kind of a fun story, this one time I had somebody who didn't show or couldn't come. And that literally the program was like the next day. So there was a Turkish professor, and I went down to him and I was like, dude, you got to help me. Can you help me get somebody to campus? And he said, absolutely, I can. So here this program starts off. And at this point in time, guys, I had done global leadership in Libya. So I had spent time in Libya after the revolution. I had been in Africa, a number of places. I was, writing and published kind of around international, conflict resolution, mediation stuff. So I thought I was pretty aware about what was happening in my world, right, in regards to this. So here I had a state representative, which would be like someone who represented Pennsylvania in Washington, D.C. She came and spoke, and then there was someone who was from a Catholic diocese, like a leader in the Catholic Church, and they came and they spoke, and they were showing slides. They had just been to Greece. This would have been like during the heightened refugee crisis, and I sat there kind of dumbfounded because I had no idea that this was happening, right? I had no idea. And then I started to think a little bit, and I was like, wow, you know what? Just like when I was back studying and I was getting my master's, and I had no idea about what was happening in Guatemala. Right? So there's two quotes that I'm going to share with you at the very end of this presentation, but one of them I'm just going to tell you quickly now, and that is, I was told an education is something that no one can ever take away from you. They can take away everything else, but they can never take away your knowledge. They can never take away what you know. And so I encourage you, as someone who advocates now for human rights, based on this experience that I had of these people coming and talking about something I had no idea about, that you continue after this to educate yourself on different things that happen in our world and figure out how you can participate, lead within that challenge of creating dialogue and conversation around it to educate others. So anyway, so that's kind of how I got involved in this. And I went to Germany, and I started interviewing and talking to these people that experienced horrific things. This had been, after the 2016 coup attempt. I ended up going to Greece multiple times, taking trauma specialists with me, et cetera, meeting with people who, and becoming kind of, family friends, I guess you could say. People that lost their children, right? Teachers, academics, professors, lawyers, judges, journalists, preschool teachers, et cetera. People that civil servants, people that lost their children, people that lost their loved ones, their spouses, in order to try to gain a new life because of the persecution that was happening, because of what I have stemmed, this kind of silent genocide that has been happening. So I did this presentation backwards a little bit, in Chicago, where I talked about a study that was recently done, and it's about women and children in Turkish prisons. All right, so I thought I would share a little bit of this with you, kind of as a case study that we look at. So I think that you guys would agree with me too, that we're all responsible to issue some kind of a call to conscience, right? To stand together and to defend all people's dignity, freedom, and human rights. Now, if we want to do this, like I said, we've got to be more knowledgeable about human suffering in the world and where human rights violations are actually happening. And it's often outside of the places that we normally think about. So here in the United States and in much of Europe, people would think about, going to Turkey, for example, for vacation, right? But there are a lot of things that happen there, just like, going to other parts of the world. There are other things that are happening there in those locations, and educating ourselves and others on what's happening is important. So let's see, this research that was done, just imagine this, I won't read it, just imagine this, that you have women and children in prisons, you've got human rights abuses that are happening, and you have interviews that are being done with them while they're in prison or right when they're out. Okay, so that's how valuable this data is. And so the idea now is that we can use this data to actually talk about about the things that are happening. So you all know that I think you do, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you just in case. So for some time now, the Turkish government has been conducting a systematic campaign in order to imprison women on these fabricated charges. And it's almost a part of a witch hunt, you could say, against critics or any people that are opponents of the ruling party, the ruling AKP party. And the whole idea about putting these women in prison is because they want to chill Turkish society. That's what I call it, chill Turkish society, right? And intimidate individuals for expressing their rights, like their freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and other different kinds of liberties. And they go into such lengths to imprison women. And in some cases, some of these women have just given birth, right? Or they're pregnant. And they subject them to torture, ill treatment, detention centers, etc. And these women that are affected in these prisons can be anywhere from the age of 18 to over 80 years old. Let me say that again: anywhere from the age of 18 to over 80 years old. And that, I'm not talking about the children, right? Within that, but you have babies and children of varying ages also, like with their mothers in there. Let me give you kind of a little bit of an idea. Here's like an artwork piece that was done. And I'm going to talk to you about just a small case study within this case study I'm talking about, and about a woman named Garibay Gazar. All right. I didn't talk about arbitrary detention, but this is a problem too. It's a severe breach of human rights that entails the wrongful arrest, incarceration, imprisonment of someone without appropriate legal responses or due process. And this is something that's happening. But soon here, I'll get to Garibay. So just some other pictures here for you. All right, so this is Garibay Gazar. Now, her story started in 2014, and she was 21 years old. Her older brother was killed in a protest, and while her family was mourning his death, her other brother was paralyzed by a shooting that broke out at the local police station, where he was inquiring about the murderer of his sibling. By the age of 23 in 2016, Garibay was a representative of the Democratic Regions Party. So she was a part of a pro-Kurdish organization in her district called Darajat. And that year, she was arrested on charges of terrorism based on her political work. Now, according to a criminal complaint that was filed by her lawyers, Garibay objected to her arrest and was subjected to violence by prison guards. She was dragged to the floor and taken to the sponge room. And the sponge room, you guys, is something that's prepared room, like for torture, and they call it the sponge room. It's insulated to prevent any kind of sound. So Garibay was subjected to severe torture, harassment, and rape while being transferred from one prison to another. She wanted to convey this to her family and her lawyers, but she stayed in solitary confinement for 22 days. After leaving solitary confinement, she attempted to write a letter upon which she was taken to the sponge room for unruly behavior. She conveyed her experiences to her family over the phone as a last resort, and her lawyers even made 22 inquiries about this. Now, Garibay remained in solitary confinement where she committed suicide in her cell. So the ministry had not opened or read the motions by her lawyers and felt the need to respond to the prison administration. And after her death, the torture and discrimination continued, and Garibay Gazar was not given a funeral vehicle, for example. Her family had to transport her body in the back of a pickup truck. Right? That's just one story. And that's a story that that came out of this study here. So the minority groups that are persecuted, Garibay would come from one of those minority groups. So let me just see here. Go on. Let me give you a couple other pictures kind of here of what has happened in Turkey. Now you can see women in prison. Let me give you another thing that another woman had said. She said, I spent 18 months in prison. It was a very difficult process for me. 27 people were staying in a 10-person cell. I slept on the floor for the first month. For the first 3 months, I couldn't get used to the smell of the iron in the ward and the urine and cigarettes that were on the bed. Doing laundry with bare hands, bad food, phone calls every 15 days, being stuck in a narrow space with 27 women. The sound of iron doors, the sound of the air conditioners, the sound of the courtyard closing, the women crying, the women fighting, the sounds of children, the children asking for the yard not to be closed, crying for more French fries. And I never got used to a lot more things during my time there. I never forgot about them either after I was released. So for many of these women, it's not necessarily the physical abuse that ruins them. Neither is it their family separations and anxiety, but it's their abused senses, right, that drive away their memories and ultimately kind of their purpose in life. Another woman talked about her precious knowledge of time. Regardless of whether it was night or day, the light inside the cell was always turned on. So we didn't know if it was because our watches were taken away. We had no idea what time it was. We could only tell by the sunshine that reflected on the wall across from our 10-centimeter window. I've heard that the police only let ladies into the public courtyard when they feel like it. So those are just some of the things that kind of came out of this study. But, the disregard for human dignity and the systemic erosion of rights undermines the very fabric of a just and equitable society. So the far-reaching implications of this regression really can't be estimated. I mean, there have been, injustice, hardship for so many people that have been accused for so many different kinds of things that anyone that wants to oppress a group of people will do. You have a certain app on your phone, or you had it. You got a certain newspaper. You banked at a bank many years ago. So these are all things that I wanted to tell you in this kind of case study, because these are things that are happening now. This is happening right now during our time. Of course, along with many, many other things in the world. But I want to bring your attention to something that is not often highlighted. It's not often in conversation, and it's not often in dialogue. And that's what I feel my purpose is now, is to work to be to use my voice, I guess you could say. I don't like how I say it sometimes, but to use my voice for people that can't use theirs, and to draw attention to these kinds of things. Couple more pictures here. Now, on the other side of this, I also, I don't know, I don't think I can show it to you, but I also want to talk to you about some resilience stories, because there's real resilience that comes out of this. I have interviewed people that, I'll give you one story quick. There was a guy who was in the military, and he was way up there when it came to like interrogation. So he would teach people, train people on how to interrogate. And he actually used those skills when he himself was taken to prison 3 times, so that he would not get tortured, and also those of his inmates. So when I talk about knowledge and the importance of education and knowledge, that's something that actually helped him. Another gentleman, and he's doing well in Germany now, another gentleman that I know worked for the government. And imagine being in your 50s, maybe mid 50s, late 50s, and moving 2 countries, learning a new language, getting to the proficiency level that you need to in order to get a job in the government of that country. And so that's another story that I think is a great resilience story, is that, there are things that come out of these kinds of oppressions and persecutions where people do go on to become very resilient and carry on the very things that they stood for, right? Peace and nonviolence, education, etc. You see people that continue to push forward for that, and that's a real sign of hope and resilience, I believe. But this story here that you're seeing about Ezra, passed away when they moved, and the father ended up getting to another country, and the daughter couldn't come. And this video just happened a month ago, and the daughter, who is now 6 years old, I think, something like that, was meeting her father in an airport, I believe in Germany. I could be wrong on that, but it was a reuniting meeting, just to kind of show you the heart, the heartache of separation for families that end up going through different kinds of human rights persecutions. Okay, so now we're on to another case study. And like I said, I wanted to bring this case study to you because I'm actually involved in this. I was asked to be on a committee, and this committee is going to be announced. So on October 4, you guys can look this up. If you just Google Mother's Call, you'll find this. You have a Palestinian NGO and you have an Israeli NGO, and they have gotten together. And they have created, and they've been working on this for a number of years, this Mother's Call to Action. So they're trying to bring peace to Palestine and Israel. And it's more of a women's movement. Now, it's kind of catered after what happened in Liberia. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with what happened in Liberia back in 1996, I want to say. But Lema Bowie, if that name resonates, she won the Nobel Peace Prize years ago, maybe 7 years ago now, but for her work in Liberia. And make a long story short, what she did is there was civil war in Monrovia. She was a social worker. She was working with people that were, being injured all the time. She, with violence in a civil war, like what was happening in Monrovia, is that, violence would escalate and then it would kind of go down for a while. You could go out and get your food and do whatever. Then violence would escalate and then it would kind of come down. Well, it was during this time when violence was escalated and she was done. She couldn't go get her kid, a piece of donut to eat. And she was done with it. So the violence is now down. She goes to church. She gets up in front of her church congregation, which was a large congregation, and she said, "I'm tired of this, and you all should be tired of it too. And I'm not doing this anymore. So I call on anybody that will, that wants to come with me, and we got to do something about this," basically. And there was a Muslim woman that stood up in the church, and she said, "I'm pretty sure nobody knows this here, but I'm probably the only Muslim woman in here." She came with her friend. And so she said, "I tell you that my Muslim sisters are with you." So now you have Muslim women, Christian women, all going to the fish market, which is where Charles Taylor, who was the dictator then, had to drive by the fish market every day on his way to work. And so this protest started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. They unified themselves by something they found in common through conversation and dialogue, which was, we're all going to wear white because Esther is a character that was in the Bible and in the Quran. And so these women all got together. Then all of a sudden, women from other countries started coming in, right? So what ended up happening? They ended up demanding peace between these two different factions. And in fact, they held them accountable to the sense that they locked them in a room. They sat out in the hallway. They surrounded the building in order to push peace. And it was an international, it got international news, et cetera, that happened then. But it's something that happened and it was successful, but it was successful because of conversation and dialogue, right? And so I kind of, look at that is, how can we look at the things that have worked in the past in regards to conversation and dialogue around different topics? This one just happens to be peace, brokering peace or peace and conflict. For the Turkey example that I gave you, that one just happens to be around, providing knowledge and educating others through conversation and dialogue and bringing attention in order to create change. But hopefully you can see how those things kind of intertwine with what it is that I'm sharing with you now. But so what's happening in Israel is what is based off of kind of what Lama Bowie did in Liberia. So I was in Morocco and happened to be at a conference, and I was asked by someone that was there who is one of the leaders of this to be on the committee. So on October 4, check your international news. I have a feeling that it should hit, at least I hope it does. If there's any information that you would want from me in order for you guys to share there, I'm more than happy to provide that to you. But this event that's going to take place, both parties are going to be coming to a table for the first time in a while, and then this committee will be announced, and I'll be a part of that committee. So what the Mother's Call 2023 is what it's called. Women Wage Peace is an organization, and Women of the Sun is the other organization. And so thousands of women from the Israeli movement, Women Wage Peace, and the Palestinian movement, Women of the Sun, will hold a mass event with this message. We Palestinian and Israeli mothers are determined to stop the vicious cycle of bloodshed and to change the reality of the difficult conflict between both nations for the benefit of our children. Now, women from the Israeli movement, Women Wage Peace, and the Palestinian movement, again called Women of the Sun, will hold a joint event on October 4th demanding to end the cycle of bloodshed and to promote what they call the Mother's Call, which was formulated by both movements and calls on peoples of both nations, Palestinian and Israeli, and people of the region. They asked people to join our call and demonstrate their support for the resolution of the conflict.
Vonya,
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that there's like half an hour left and we do need to put a question. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Wow. Okay. I've been talking a long time, you guys. That's not good. I usually don't like to do that. Thank you for telling me. I was looking at my clock here. Okay, so this is just if you want these slides, I can definitely hand them over. This was just like some background. I was going to give you some recent developments, but if you guys are watching the news, you kind of know what's been happening there. This conflict is something that's been going on for 130 to 140 years. And I give you the example of this conflict because there are also other conflicts within your own areas, within your own countries, that you can look and say, you know what, this is a kind of model that might work here, that kind of thing. Okay. Real quick, the need for dialogue and conversation experts today. That's what I look at you guys. I'm like, you guys are the next experts in this area, no matter what it is that you're working in, right? We've got increased polarization. We've got a digital age that's booming, complex global challenges, cultural sensitivity needs to be built around globalization. Education and training has to happen. Community building needs to happen. And all of this, restorative justice, all of this revolves around dialogue and conversation. All right, so I'll end it there. Do you guys have any questions for me?
Can I talk now?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Madam. One of the best statements that I heard, the Palestinian woman that they say, conflict is really a vicious cycle. I really like this statement. Besides this, I want to say or ask that how can all happen to Turkish people in 21st century, where the government of Turkey participates in United Nations human rights programs or conferences? Why the government do not push any sanctions or any prohibitions for them to prevent the government to what they are doing to Turkish people? It's really unfair.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I get that question asked a lot to me, especially, when people are a little, they're unfamiliar with some of the background, in regards to Turkey. So if you think about how other areas of the world operate, and I'm going to take you back, because we talked about Hitler, right? Hitler used propaganda. There was a way of controlling the masses of people. And that can be done a couple of different ways. And these are actually steps within the genocide process, okay? You dehumanize people. You label them. You call them names. When you start to go down this path, you start to create what we would call the other, right? The other. You're the other. You're different, not like us. And once you start to create that in a society, then what you have is you have people that will go after the other. We saw it happen in Russia, right? We've seen it happen in Eastern Europe. It's the same kind of thing. The only thing that's happening now is that we're trying to call attention to something that is happening more silently. So, we have technology now. We're huge advanced in technology. So we can silence people in many different ways. So one of the reasons that I would say the Turkish government has such a hold kind of on this is because Turkey is the largest holder of refugees in the world, right? So when you look at politics, people have to play politics with Erdogan. So for example, he's already done this. He says, okay, EU, European Union, you better give me more money. If you don't give me more money, you don't do what I want, I'm going to open my doors and I'm going to let everybody go, right? And he did that. So there's that reason. Another reason is that if you look at politics, you look at the strategic location of Turkey. For the United States, this is like a really important area, right? It's kind of a gateway into that area of the world. So Turkey strategically is located at a place. Now, does the Turkish government get their hands spanked, you could say, like for human rights abuses all the time? Are there reports that are written about them all the time? Do they have, I think they're the second country with the most journalists in prison right now. So a lot of these things happen, but actually holding someone accountable, if it's not a mass genocide, mass killing, it's harder to do. So the Turkey Tribunal is one way to do that. You also have people starting to create more awareness about what's happening. And by doing that, that does two things. One is that it can put pressure on a government because more knowledge is being spread about what is happening. It also makes it more difficult for people to be able to talk about what's happening, or people that have experienced something. Why? Because if, for example, my friend, here in the United States, if she were to talk about her story and about her family's back in Turkey. So they'll go back to her family and they'll say, okay, now we'll take one of you. Do you see what I mean? So it's a very nuanced situation, but it's definitely something that's got to be brought to the forefront, and it's got to be talked about. We have to create dialogue about it. We have to create more awareness about it, because you're talking about minority groups of people within Turkey, and the Hizmet movement, which I didn't even have time to go through any of that, but you have people that are are about peace and justice, and about education, and about dialogue, interfaith dialogue, making the world a better place, that have been targeted specifically for this. And dictators do that too. They've got to have people that they can demean and dehumanize in order to keep themselves in power. Right. And if you think about the intellectuals that are involved within that group, that would just make it a normal, thing for a dictator to go after. But that was a great question. I hope I answered it okay for you.
Thank you so much. And you traveled to several points of the world. I want to invite you to Afghanistan too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. You know what? I was going to show you guys. I think I put it in here. Hold on a second. Here we go. Do you see that? Do you see that slide?
Yes.
Okay. So two of my favorite quotes. One is a Dari proverb. Now you want to say it because I'll say it wrong. Quatra, quatra.
Qatra qatra daryo meshad. Yes. Qatra qatra daryo meshad. Yes.
Okay, there you go. You guys heard it. So that is one of my favorite quotes. And it has been, when I was in Libya, I was actually with a group of people that were from Afghanistan. So I have a real love for your country and for you guys. But that quote means drop by drop a river is made. So Sanal, if you make a drop, I'm going to butcher your names probably here, but Kulsum, if you make a drop, Naeem, you make a drop, Bazad, you make a drop, everybody makes one kind of a drop, then maybe you can get something moving, right? So I truly believe that. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I have a question.
Okay.
Because we are talking about all these things like, international human rights, and we're talking about Turkey and Palestine and a lot of other countries that, the essence of the problem is similar, if not exactly the same, right? And how would you say, as somebody who's been working in human rights for so long, how would you say people like us who maybe don't have the opportunity to work on the ground internationally, how do we add that drop so that the river is made?
That's a great question, Kulsum. Very good question. So you know what? There are lots of different ways that you can do that. You can be a voice. I mean, just look at technology. Look at what we're doing right now. Right? You have access to different things that you guys use, and Instagram, Snapchat, whatever it is, social media kinds of things. You probably are involved, Kuslam, in different groups that you have. Whether it be in the community or whether it be at school, projects that you can be involved in, on first, like educating yourself, about different things. And that's just making a drop, just doing that, right? That's creating more knowledge. And that knowledge is valuable. It's very valuable to you. So that's something. You could volunteer for organizations like mine, Refugees Unknown Stories Untold, where we work to digitally document these stories so that they're not lost in history, and so that these stories can be used by journalists and people at the UN, people that need information for different things. You can, educate your friends when you're out. Like, did you know that this was happening? Even those kinds of simple things. But Kuslam, the one thing that I've seen people do is create movements within their own, societies and their own communities. And you can use things that are happening in the world to also bridge what's happening in your own community or in your own areas too. So, I've seen that happen. And I actually even do that. I spoke at the district attorney's office here in Philadelphia last week, and I used this information like from Turkey. And then I kind of wove it into what's happening with the shootings and the killings and the things that are happening in Philadelphia. So you can bridge your knowledge between different areas too. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I'll definitely be looking up some of your volunteering stuff.
Yeah, please do. You can go to my website. I think I put the card on there. There you go. You can go to the website and you can email me too.
All right.
So there's my email right there, and that'll get to me directly. So I'd love to have you. I'm always looking for people to do different things and, put out different stories and information and stuff like that. So we can kind of get an idea of what it is that you want to do. Right. And I'll try to connect you, whether it's through me or through another organization as well.
That's great.
We have a lot of story about Afghanistan. We can share it to you.
What's that? You have stories for me? That would be great.
Yeah.
I will
share.
I would love that. I would love that.
Beautiful.
I think Sonal has a question that she wants to ask.
Yeah, Sonal.
Hi, Vonya. Thank you so much for this beautiful and wonderful session. It was very eye-opening for all of us. And I would like to ask you one question. Well, it is a very sensitive issue over here in India right now, currently going on, as many of you must be knowing what's happening to the Manipur. It's the community violence, community conflict going on over there, which leads to violence. And so what we have done, like being in the center of the India, we have offered our help to some of the students over there from Manipur, those who have lost their families in front of their eyes, those who have lost their homes, their belongings, their documents, everything. And those children, they are traumatized. And so my question is, in this situation, how to bring that trust, build up that trust with them, making them feel safe, as well as how to initiate a dialogue with them so that we do not show any pity to them, but like to make them sure that we are here, it's a safe space and all. And these children, they are just graduating students. Our university has offered them to give the education for free and their stay as well, and we'll be covering their food expenses and everything. So, but the main thing, because I am yet to meet them, I'll be meeting them tomorrow. So, but to my the information I got, that they are numb, they are not speaking, they are not sharing anything. So, how to deal with this situation?
So, if I think about that, Sonal, I think about when, I've spent time in Greece and Germany with kids about the same age, young, anywhere from like 16 to maybe early 20s, that have experienced, similar, I don't know, similar kinds of things, you could say. Some of them lost, family members drowning, in front of them, that kind of thing. So the trauma is very prevalent. And so what I noticed, like I think I told you at the beginning, I took a trauma specialist with me. And one of the things that they do is they encourage them to talk. And so I think as a university, the university, I don't know whether you have this or not, can offer psychological kinds of services for people, but just conversation. So not dialogue specifically. So not setting up something, remember, with more formal kind of procedures to it, but more conversational kinds of settings help people to unwind. All right. But I really, it was a pleasure for me to talk to you. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I wish you guys the best, because you know what? You guys are all dialogue experts. So thank you for doing that.